Hello and welcome to another podcast by Asian Agribis. I'm Meliana. In this episode, our regional correspondent from Indonesia, Arif Fahrudin, is speaking with Dr. Teguh Prajitno, discussing about updates on avian influenza outbreaks in Asia and its control strategies. Dr. Prajitno is a molecular biologist and managing director of Java Strategic Business Unit, Animal Health and Livestock Equipment.
Hello, Dr. Teguh. It's nice to have you in this podcast.
Okay, yeah, it's a great honor for me to be here in your podcast, and hopefully we can learn from this podcast and sharing our experiences with you and the audience out there.
Great. The past couple of months has seen avian influenza outbreaks in many countries in Asia. From our Avian Influenza Monitor page, the outbreaks have been in Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, India, South Korea, and the latest one in Japan. Not only in commercial poultry farms, but also in backyard farms and wild birds. Why are these outbreaks so extensive despite precautions? Are we missing something?
To understand why these outbreaks happens, we have also to understand the virus itself. So we are dealing with the type A, a highly pathogenic avian influenza virus of H5 subtype here. So it is not a uniform virus. So we have to look at the virus itself. We know that the virus has spilled off from the migratory birds to domestic poultry in China in the late 1990s. And it created, since then, different genetic diversities of H5N1 viruses here. We have also to look into the history of this virus and how it conquered the world after that. We know in total it has been 4 global spread of H5 avian influenza viruses into the world since the early 2000s. It started with H5N1 and continues with SH5NX as reassortment events with local circulating avian influenza viruses has created variation in neuraminidase makeups and created N2, N5, N6, and 8 viruses. So I will come back to these 4 global spreads. So the first global spread and panzootic of H5N1 began in 2003 with the transmission of the virus from China to its neighboring countries in Asia. So we remember in 2003, it has generated different clades of H5N1 as they were clades 0, 1, and 2. And since then, the H5N1 virus has been a fast mutating strain. It has created many subclades of second, third, and even fourth order. So H5N1 has become endemic and entrenched in domestic birds, limited to a certain countries like the clade 2.13 in Indonesia, and but others they are more successful in spreading and spread further to other countries. Yeah. So like the 2006 H5N1 subclade of 2.2. Which actually were spread by wild waterfalls from Qinghai Lake in western China. And it has been carried to westward and southwestwards to Europe, Middle East, North Africa, like Egypt, and South Asia, like India and Bangladesh. And it has been introduced in this region to the domestic poultries, and it stayed quite sometimes in the domestic poultries like in Egypt and India. However, the clade 2.2 H5N1 viruses have not been able to spread further and just is recently being replaced by other H5 viruses. Then in 2011 and 12, a very successful H5N1 mutant has been spread from China by migratory waterfalls to countries like in Asia. So we know we in Indonesia we talk about duck viruses, and we know that this duck virus of clade 2.3 to 0.21c is a descendant of clade 2.3.2, which has been circulating in China since the early 2000s. So this event has been considered as the third panzootic H5N1 spread. Then in 2013 and 15, another sublineage of this clade 2.3 has spread around the world, namely the clade 2.3.4.4, which has been first reported as H5N1 in 2008 in China, but suddenly spread by wild waterfalls explosively, panzootically to domestic birds into the rest of the world. In doing so, this sublineage underwent genetic reassortment with various naturally occurring low-path viruses and switched out its long-stable N1 subtype for importation of several neuraminidase subtypes, including N2, N5, N6, and N8. So we see this unprecedented series of events resulted in multiple so-called H5N6 viruses. Since then, we see H5N6 viruses predominated in Asia, and H5N8 were exported in independent sublineages westwards to Europe and eastwards to North America. So we know back in 2015, in North America, the H5N8 virus reassorted with local N2 viruses in North America and become H5N2 virus and spread in early 2015 to 21 states of the United States and causing a loss of 50 million poultry mortalities and at the cost of 5 billion US dollar. Actually, the same virus also went westwards to Europe, and both basically North America and Europe could stamp out the virus, and the virus disappeared from both continents recently. But with the years to come, it has been always new introduction of this subclade into Europe and causing mortalities in domestic birds. And in southern China, we know the H5N6 has become so widespread in duck population that it has largely replaced H5N1 as a dominant avian influenza strain seen in poultry markets. So since 2016, we also see that the clade 2.3.4.4 has further mutated to a fifth order, so which has been appended with letter since then, such as A, B, C, D, rather than another number. So we are talking about 2344B, which is actually H5N8 virus. And it's again in 2016 spread out from China along with migratory bird pathway from Russia, Mongolia, China into Europe and North Africa and the Middle East and India. This is the same path the 2006 virus of clade 2.2 took when it spread in 2006. At the same time, we see that H5 clades become dominant in Asia. There are namely two. One is the 2321C, H5N1, and the 2344, the H5NX. And both viruses are actually a dominant, or you can say exotic in many countries in Southeast Asia, and occasionally introduced to Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Philippines, like it has recently be observed. So when we talk about the recent dominant viruses in North Vietnam, we actually see that is a H5N6, and it is a 2344G virus, while in South Vietnam, we see a H5N1 population of clade 2.3, 2.1C. So Vietnam has two different sets of viruses which they have to control. And recently they are using vaccination, and it will be difficult to control both disease with the current vaccine used in Vietnam. So, and as you mentioned before, recently we see new introduction into Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. I have seen the data, and it is the H5N6 virus, and but it is a different subclade. This is a 2344C rather than the 2344G in Vietnam, and differs from the 2344H in China. So we have different orders of this order or descendants of this virus. Yeah.
What about the low pathogenic avian influenza viruses?
So besides of these high-pass AI, we need also to address the most important low-pass AI virus strain, which is namely H9N2, because it has public health importance and it is willing able to reabsorb with high-pass viruses and create new kind of viruses because it is considered as a donor virus for internal genes. Yeah. The H9N2, that there are three subtypes in the world. So we are talking about the Y280 group, which is currently very dominant in Asia. And again, the Y280 is the has been divided into different subclades, and then subclade 9.4.2.5. This is the most, let's say, successful strain in China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Myanmar, and most probably in other region in our other countries in these regions. Yeah. The G1 strain, which is the subclade 9.4.3.2 or 3 or 1, there are three subclade in this G1 group, is predominantly causing problems in poultry in South Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa. This virus has been also introduced into Southeast Europe. Yeah. So from the above history, we can see that the wild birds have been continuously introduced new variants of AI viruses and required a constant alertness for us to monitor and do surveillance to look at the variances and to detect those variances there. So, and the measurements applied in all these countries are quite diverse. Yeah, whether it applies vaccinations or prohibit vaccination, often they are not effective enough, as most probably a great diversity of AI viruses has been exotic already in wild birds, and those wild birds can steadily spread this virus to domestic poultry in different countries. And often resources and compensations to successfully stamp out outbreaks are not available, and also we are lack of resource and funding that are required to actively monitor and circulate and monitor the circulation of AI virus are not priorities in many countries. In countries like Indonesia or Vietnam that apply vaccination, we see that the policy and program to update seed strains for vaccines are often not updated. Yes. So these are all the reasons why we constantly see new introduction of AI viruses into the countries. Maybe this is one explanation of your questions.
Interesting. If we relate your answer about the virus strains and vaccines, what is the best option of AI vaccines that we should use?
Again, as outlined before, we have two different but very dominant main clades in Asia. Yeah, we have the H5N1, which is the clade 2.3.1.2c, a somewhat more diverse clade of H5NX, because it could be N2, it could be N5, it could be N6, it could be N8. Yeah. And this clade belongs to the family of 2344, which has mainly in Asia been divided into three major subclades, which is 344C, which circulate in North Korea, China, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. There's 2344G in Vietnam to 2344H in South China. So if you look at this diversity, of course, you need to look at the vaccine strategy. So there is no one size fits all solution if you talk about avian influenza vaccination. Yeah. So you need to look at those strains to define the strategy, which seed virus are you going to use for the vaccines. Because the only way to sustainably control AI in an endemic situation is to vaccinate domestic birds. As we know, AI viruses are being constantly spread among domestic poultry in traditional live bird market chain, but also through introduction by wild birds. What we need to do by vaccination is actually to reduce the viral load in the environment. So how we can do it, actually, we want to reduce the infection, the clinical disease itself, and the shedding cycle. So while vaccination can only reduce clinical disease and virus shedding, it is only the third pillar in the control of AI. The first and second pillar is more important as we deal with biosecurity and farm management practices. With these three pillars, this is how we actually can control avian influenza in the domestic poultry industry. Yeah. So in addition, again, you have to come back that we need to apply monitoring and surveillance program in order to identify the new emerging variants of AI, which has actually been as a result of antigenic shifts or detect an antigenic drift occurs in the enzootic virus due to immune pressure we put on the virus by using vaccination. So we know we apply vaccination, we put pressure on the virus to mutate. So, and this antigenic drift, we can actually measure, we can monitor, we can detect. And once we see the antigenic relevant mutation, we must update the seed. Again, there's no one size fits all solution in avian influenza.
So it means that we really need to keep updating, right?
Yes, of course, the updates of viruses should be actually being done by the government and or the government related labs. But of course, there are many experts out there from countries and also laboratories. We are work on the avian influenza surveillance monitoring program. And I think like in the past, when FAO took the lead to actually fund programs for monitoring and fund also programs for sharing experiences for other countries involving government and poultry industries. I think this will be lead to a more transparency and so help the countries and in particular the poultry industry in the affected countries. Yeah.
Interesting. I heard that some poultry breeding companies have been using autogenous vaccine. Do you have comment about this?
Autogenous vaccines is not regulated in many of the countries because it is for influenza it is not regulated, but for other diseases it is quite common in North America and also in Europe. So how it works is basically you take samples from affected farms or regions, and then you actually characterize the virus and you produce the autogenous vaccines. And even in the US, they use low path AI viruses or vaccines for the turkey industry. So this is not new things in the poultry industry, and it is very beneficial because as vaccine companies in the world become consolidated, we see the few vaccine companies, they cannot focus on new emerging diseases of, let's say, less economical importance for them. Yeah. So, because if we talk about particular diseases for the poultry industry, may be very important, but for vaccine supplier might be less useful because they have a certain limitation in capacity of production. So we advise actually the government, and we talk to our government how to enable to allow us to produce autogenous vaccine to be used in the poultry industry. But again, this in Asia, this concept is still not very much implemented. Yeah. So in particular for H5N1, we need more often updates as the virus mutates. So we need different tools to, like, maybe from the seasonal human influenza vaccines, that they look at the virus mutations, and they recommend to use a particular seed virus for the coming flu season. Yeah. So I'm not very content with this idea to apply in the poultry industry, because it's not feasible, because we are in an endemic situation. We need to have not a seasonal vaccination, we need a year-long vaccination.
Excellent. Let's talk about live bird markets. They're still dominant in many countries in Asia, and the AI virus has been identified in many. How can these live bird markets stem the presence and spread of AI in poultry and to humans?
Yeah, we know the traditional marketing chain is where the virus is being maintained. Yeah. So, and its marketing system, or this traditional marketing chain, is also a breeding ground for newer reassortant viruses. Yeah. So we know that we see waterfalls, we see domestic chickens, long-lived birds like layers and breeders, span hens, and but also short-lived broiler and ayam kampung native chickens. So viruses will be able to jump from different species, from ducks to chicken and vice versa. And we know that two different viruses can actually co-infect a duck or in chicken at the same time. And as AI viruses consist of 8 separate genes, it is a segmented virus. They have 8 separate genes encoding for 11 proteins. So the mixing of the different genes can occur during this infection of chickens or ducks in this live bird market. So we have learned, in particular, like the H7N9 infections, or generation of H7N9 viruses in China, which occurs in the live bird market in China, in East China. This virus has three precursors. One is the H9N2, one is H7 gene, and the other one provide the N9 gene. Yes. So we see the live bird market is, on the long run, is always being a breeding ground for a new reassortment of AI viruses. So for government, it is advisable to look at this kind of marketing system. Yeah. So of course, besides of AI viruses, it is also not hygienic. We can talk, and we can find other pathogens and zoonotic agents like salmonella. We can see other other bacteria which has public health impact. So a monitoring and surveillance program for these live bird markets is absolutely needed. We need to identify the presence of new emerging viruses And we have to actually apply a very, very stringent cleaning and disinfection program, and in combination with downtime even, and to cut the infection cycles in the live bird market. Yeah, so we need to impose this program, and also constantly monitor what is circulating. And I remember FAO had this program in Indonesia before, but after the project has finished and has so the program stops also. So this is what government or the municipal government has to do, and to protect its people. Yeah, and on the long run, we have to move to hygienic slaughtering, to slaughterhouses, so where poultry should be actually processed to the norm of hygienic and safe food processing. Yeah. And I think the industry is ready for that. The radio industry will move into this kind of system, because we need to make sure that the public health impact is controlled in this, or is the public health impact is minimized in this system.
Do you have examples of countries that have been successful in modernizing their traditional markets?
We actually see what has been done in Vietnam. Yeah. So when we have we had problem with H5N1 in 2003, the Vietnamese government actually very fast moved from traditional slaughtering into slaughtering in slaughterhouses. Yeah, so in hygienic. So they prevent the move from live birds from the farms coming into the cities. So we have seen that Vietnam started it. And of course, in Asia, we have to talk about Thailand. Thailand has absolute modernized its poultry farming system, but also upstream and downstream. So we know that they have huge hygienic slaughterhouses controlled by the government. And of course, Vietnam and Thailand are also countries which also benefit from some export activities. In particular, Thailand has been a poultry meat exporter to Europe and to Japan. So they have some incentive actually to modernize their slaughter system or marketing system. And also, apart from slaughtering, we have to move to further processing, and also to like ready to eat meals, and also some cooked products rather than just the carcass.
Interesting. You mentioned about three pillars. The first one is biosecurity and surveillance, and then second one farm management, and the third one is vaccination. And recently a group of researchers suggests transparency and openness from each country to be included to control the global spread of avian influenza. What are your thoughts?
Yes, if you talk about the disease itself, of course, as a in the poultry industry, of course, we are just part of the country, and we are actually focusing to control our assets. Yeah, so this is why we apply these three pillars, which is biosecurity and monitoring, and do surveillance on our own limited region. Then, of course, farm management, sound management, and to actually to maintain the overall well-being of the and I agree actually with the group of researchers suggested transparency and openness from each countries, but it is not very easy, because countries have their own policy, and we know the virus H5 virus has been around since the late 1990s, and where actually the virus has been detected in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was very to identify the virus, to report them, reporting system to IE. Um, it is compulsory, but of course, again, whether countries are following this or not, this is another question. But to admit the disease is endemic or exotic in a particular country, uh, we need to have the gut actually to report it and to declare it. Yeah. So because uh, this this is needed actually to apply another strategy to get rid of the virus. If you're endemic, you cannot just say, okay, we go for stamping out, because endemic situations, many countries don't have the fund to compensate farmers. So in an endemic situation, we have to apply vaccination to reduce the viral load and then to come up with the exit strategy. Yeah. So so we know that from the Hong Kong situation in the 1997, that the H5N1 subtypes have been transmitted directly from domestic poultry to humans and cause a spectrum of human diseases, from asymptomatic to severe or fatal diseases. So we need to take avian influenza more seriously. We know it is in poultry. But it can affect mammals, including humans. Always be connected with a certain risk of pandemic, yeah, as happened to human, yeah, like the 1918 Spanish flu. Then we had this 1968 H3N2 Hong Kong flu. We had this 1977 Russian flu and H5N1, and then the latest H1N1 swine flu of Mexican flu in 2009. So it has pandemic risk, yeah. So we need to take it seriously, and of course, we are currently the COVID-19 pandemic, and with all its public health impact, public life, socio-economic impact, and it has taught us that the government has to show some seriousness, transparency, openness, integrity, and accountability in all its efforts to control and to provide an intervention program aiming to reduce the risk of the pandemic. Yeah. Otherwise, new pandemic viruses will emerge. Yeah. So we have learned all about this. So I agree with all this group of researchers that we have to be transparent, we have to open up, we have to share data, and we have to have international collaborations to characterize viruses, and also in terms of even in vaccines, we need to have a strategy where we can update seeds, and also using system which is actually recognized by many of the researchers. So we must move away from this egocentric approach leadership to a more scientific approach for the sake of the common good and to prevent another global pandemic and in influenza.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your great explanation, Dr. Teguh.
With their constant mutation, avian influenza viruses continue to threaten the Asian poultry industry. Biosecurity, surveillance, elimination of infected flocks, and vaccination are key tools to control the disease. We hope you found this episode useful. You can download it on www.asian-agribis.com to share with your colleagues. Thank you for joining us. Once again, this is Meliana from Asian Agribis saying thanks and inviting you to join us in our future podcast.